Something new this month is Bicep, which is a infrastructure as code tool for deploying resources to Azure. You'll see here in the prerequisites that there are some steps for installing Bicep. It does install as part of the Azure CLI, and it's a pretty quick and easy installation. So in our first exercise, we're going to deploy some of our lab resources using Bicep. So we get exposure to using infrastructure as code, which is best practice for managing your resources in Azure. So the first thing that we'll do is switch over to Visual Studio and take a look at the Bicep file, which is in the folder month 2 day 1 hands log files, month 2 day 1 Bicep. So let's take a look. So here in our repository we have month 2 day 1, we have hands-on lab files, and here in hands-on lab files you'll see a couple different Bicep files, and the one that we're looking for is month 2 underscore day 1 dot bicep. So you can see in the Bicep file that we do have parameters, things such as the location for the resources in Azure. We have a first name, a last name, a favorite animal. We'll talk about that in a little bit more in a bit. And then we have a calculated student prefix here. So this is some of the first exposure in Bicep for various methods or functions that you can use for doing things in Bicep, for things such as getting a unique string or string concatenations, things along those lines. You'll see that we first have our first resource in the file, which is an IoT hub, and you can see the structure of the file is pretty straightforward, that we just have the name of a resource, we have location, and you'll notice on this name here that we're actually doing a pretty simple string concatenation. Again, Azure IoT best practices for naming, we have IoT dash and then a unique name that we're generating per student to make sure that we don't have naming collisions for public things such as DNS entries, URLs that will show up during this lab. We also have a device provisioning service that you can see next. Very similar setup. And you'll notice one of the things here on this resource is that we have IoT hubs, and we, as part of our infrastructure as code template or a Bicep template, we are creating a linked hub for this DPS. In month 1, this is something that we did manually. So you can see some of the time savings that comes from using Bicep. We have a logic app, which we will use in the last part of the lab. We'll touch on that more later. We have a log analytics workspace. You can see some of the settings here. Again, using Azure naming best practices, so we prefix with log dash, and then you can see that we've set retention days to 30 days, an example of settings. And then we also have a storage account that's used for hosting our Azure IoT Edge modules for Azure Stream Analytics. So as I mentioned earlier, it is possible to preview or view Markdown within Visual Studio Code. You can install an extension called Markdown Preview Enhanced. So you can see I'm using the command palette and using the open preview command. So I'm opening this so I can continue to follow the instructions as we go through this course. So now that we've finished reviewing the Bicep file, let's take a look at the Bicep visualizer. So you can see all we have to do is use the command palette. If you're on Windows, you can use Control-Shift-P to bring up the command palette. If you type visual, then you'll see an option for opening the Bicep visualizer. And the file that we'll be selecting is the one that we just reviewed, which is month2 day1.bicep, and then you'll see a diagram as such. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to use the command palette, Control-Shift-B, search for visual, and then open Bicep Visualizer to the side. I press enter. I select my file. You can see that I have my month to day one bicep file here. If you don't see it in the list here, you may need to navigate your directory to find it. So I'll go ahead and press enter. And you can see a visualization on the right hand side of the resources that are part of this. So you can see our 5 resources. You do see the link between DPS and IoT Hub, and what this shows is a dependency within Azure ARM or Azure Bicep. So this means that the DPS resource is dependent on IoT Hub. It has a reference to it. Now that we completed that step, let's move on. So for our next step, we're going to actually set some parameters on our bicep file. So for our parameters, you can see we reference hand-on lab files, month to day one params.json. So we're going to open that file, and then we're going to edit the following values: first name, last name, and favorite animal. So let's go ahead and do that. So here I have my params, month to day one params file. Make sure you get the correct one, not the one that says create VM, the one that says month to day one params. I'm going to set a value here, so I'll set my name. I'm going to set a favorite animal. Maybe I'll go with a cat this time. The reason that we're asking for favorite animal here is it really could be anything, but we're using this to make sure that if we have multiple students with the same names, that when we generate resource names, that we don't generate the same names. So try to pick something unique here, but really this could be anything. Section 3.5, ensuring that you've selected the correct subscription in the Azure CLI and that you're in the correct tenant. So the first thing that we'll do is AZ account show to see which subscription is currently set as default. So you can see in this case for me it's a Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. You can see tenant ID, the email address, alanblythe@hotmail.com is not the correct account that I'd like to use for this lab. So I'm going to skip the instructions here down to where it says if your subscription isn't listed. So I'm going to run AZ logout. And the next I'm going to run AZ login. This will take me to my browser. You'll see here I have an email address I created for this lab exercise, IoT Academy Month 2 ab@outlook.com. An important note is I'm using Microsoft Edge browser profiles. You can see here I have one for my Hotmail personal address, I have 2 for IoT Academy, and then I have 1 for work as well. This is the strategy that I use to stop my accounts from getting mixed up when I'm doing things between work and personal. And you can see the profile that I'm signed in right now, which I believe is maybe a llama, is the IoT Academy M2 D1 for month 2 day 1 profile. So what I've done is I've created this profile and renamed it, and then I ensured that this browser, this instance for this profile, is the most recent one that I've used. When I'm in Visual Studio Code and I run the AZ login command, it's going to open to your most recently used browser. So that's why it's opening under this profile. So now that we've covered Edge profiles, I'm going to go ahead and select my correct account here. It'll say that we're done. I'm going to close this tab and switch back to Visual Studio Code. So now we've completed this step. Now we can run as the instruction say AZ account show again, and here you can see that I have a subscription ID It's named Azure Subscription 1. This is the tenant, and this is the email address, and this is in fact the correct subscription. So that means I can continue on from this step now. If I saw multiple subscriptions, I could go back in the prior steps and run the AZ account set, passing the subscription ID to make that the active subscription or the default subscription. Since mine's set correctly, we can move on to section 3.6. Section 3.6, creating an Azure resource group. So in this section, we're going to create a resource group, which, as we saw in month 1, is a container in Azure to hold a collection of resources. We do need to provision it in a certain location. You can see in my example command here that I've chosen North Central US. An important note, similar to month 1 for our Azure IoT Academy, is that there is limited availabilities for VMs or virtual machines in Azure. As we do provision a virtual machine as part of this lab, it's important that you select a location that has VM availability. If you pick some of the major Azure regions, such as East US, you may have trouble finding a VM of the size that you'd like. In the later section for creating VMs, there is some instruction for how to manually look and find for regions that have availability. So that's something you may want to do before continuing on with this section. And so what we'll do is first, let's make sure that your terminal is open. If it's not, you can go to terminal, new terminal, and then let's make sure that you're in the correct directory. So you can see here that I'm in month 2 day 1 hands-on lab files. This is the directory that we need to be in to run this command. If I have just cloned this repo and opened this folder in VS Code, I might be in this folder, so I would need to switch to the correct directory, onto day 1 hands-on lab files, and now I would be in the correct directory. Your command might look a little bit differently if you're using command on Windows or PowerShell. This is a bash terminal. So now that I'm in the correct directory, I'm going to run az group create, and again, you'll need to change the location for the one appropriate for you. In my case, I am provisioning in North Central US. So you can see that I quickly get a response that it was created successfully. You'll see provision state succeeded here. If I switch over to my browser, over here we'll see RG IoT Academy. If you don't see it, maybe try refreshing your page, and then you'll see it here. So here's my new resource group. You can see my subscription ID from earlier. And no resources, since we haven't created anything yet. So let's go back to VS Code. And now we'll move on to section 3.7. Section 3.7, deploying lab resources with Azure Resource Manager deployments. So in this section we'll be using Bicep, which is an infrastructure as code tool, to deploy our lab resources. As we saw in the visualization earlier, we have 5 resources that we'll be deploying. This will save a lot of time during this lab, allowing time for more progress and more content. So the template contains 5 different resources that we saw earlier, but some of the ones that we do have are IoT Hub, DPS, and Logic Apps. One of the first things that you'll need to do is make sure that you're in the hands-on lab files directory, or in the HOL_files directory. So you can see if you're at the root of the repository, you could run cd month2 day 1 HOL files. I'm already in that directory, so I won't need to. Next thing that we'll need to do is run the az deployment group create command. So this will actually deploy our Bicep template using the given parameters. So I'm going to paste that into my terminal, press enter. Once I see that's accepted the command and it says running, I'm going to switch gears over to the Azure portal. Now here on the Azure portal, we can see that I'm logged in with the correct account that I'm using, and we can see the resource group RG IoT Academy. If we come here and look at deployments, we'll see that there is a month to day 1 deployment. This is what you would expect to see. You can see it's in a deploying state. If I click the name, I'll be able to see the details. So here on the details, we can see that the Logic app has already been successfully created. A log analytics workspace has already been deployed. We have a storage account following best practices for all these with prefixes such as log dash, logic dash, storage accounts starting with ST. So this one ends in edge. And everything between on all these resources is your calculated student prefix. So we can see that IoT Hub is currently deploying. So while we wait for that to run, we can take a look at a couple other things. So if we look at inputs, so that parameters file that we updated a little while ago, we saw that we selected a location, and in my case it was North Central US. I entered my first name, my last name, and my favorite animal. And you can see that we did have a calculated student prefix as a parameter as well, and you can see that prefix here. So this is your student prefix. We can look at outputs. There are no outputs since the template is still running. And then we can take a look at the template itself. And you'll notice here that this is JSON. This does not look like the bicep file. You'll notice it's quite a bit longer. So this is actually an ARM template. And as we saw in our presentation material, bicep is an extension of Azure Resource Manager templates, or ARM templates. So when we deploy a bicep template, it really is a conversion to an ARM template. We'll go back to overview so we can take a look at our deployment, and we can see that the IoT Hub has in fact finished deploying. And now we are deploying a device provisioning service resource, a DPS. When your deployment's complete, you'll see a page similar to this, where you can click the go to resource group button. We come here and now we'll see all 5 of our resources that we had as part of that bicep template. So with that, let's take a look back at our lab instructions over in VS Code. So we can see deploying, we see the overview, we see complete, go to resource group. Next thing that you can notice is in the terminal where you executed the command, you can also see a response for the successful deployment of your bicep template. And you'll notice the provisioning state succeeded message here. If this had failed, you'd see a red error message in your terminal indicating as such.